so I'm going to go through with you what there is and how to use our working ink supercapacitor kit. So what's in it, and then we're going to make a capacitor out of it, a supercapacitor. Now this is available on the Indiegogo campaign, and the link to it is down below in the description, so just click on the description if you want one of these kits. We are going to sell this in the shop, but we won't sell it in the shop until the Indiegogo campaign has closed, and it will be more expensive in the shop because it's obviously been discounted for the campaign as a thank you for supporting what we're doing and for helping us get the Twizy thing done. So, what's in this kit? Well, if we open it up, what we've tried to do is provide you the basics of what you're going to need to do some experimentation. So you'll find yourself some gloves, and I'm going to put them on because although these materials aren't themselves dangerous, they're very fine carbons. So they do get in your skin, and they do take quite a bit of washing out. So simply wearing a pair of gloves helps an awful lot with that. Then we've provided you with 4 different carbons. Now the first one that you're probably going to be interested in is this one. This is graphene. So we've provided you with 15 millilitres of graphene there. Then we've also provided you with something called Ketchen. And this Ketchen is the Ketchen 600. What that is around about 5 to 9 nanometer spherical pieces of carbon that are hollow spheres. So it's extraordinarily light and spherical. It's a nice carbon. We've also provided you with a bog standard activated carbon made from coconut fibre. This is what's used in supercapacitors at the moment, incidentally, and I think it's steam activated. Then the final thing we've provided you with is some 5 micrometer sized graphite. This is particularly good if you want to add it as something as a conductive additive to something. Now usually when you're making your own carbons, if they're not conductive enough, then the percentage by weight is round about 10% by weight of this stuff will give it enough conductivity that your carbon will work. We've also provided you with 2 binders. This binder is a casein sodium silicate binder, so it is alkali, not terribly alkali, but it is alkali, and it's very good for water-based systems. And then we have another one which is a 70-30 split of carboxymethyl cellulose and styrene butadiene rubber. Now there aren't much of these things because you don't need much of these things. These, you use somewhere between 5 and 20% of binder depending on your particle size, and you'll get that because if you don't put enough binder in, you'll get particle drift of the very small particles. That is, your separator will get black, and you'll see that your supercapacitor won't hold its charge. And that's because the particles are coming away, and you need to add a little bit more binder in your mix to glue those particles down. If you add too much binder, then it just won't work. So you'll know you're adding too much because you won't be able to get it to hold a charge at all. It won't take a charge. You know you're adding too little because it won't hold the charge particularly well, and you'll get that blackness drifting through your separator and you'll see it. So though you don't need to use much of them, you do need to play with them a bit. Then we provided you with 2 salts. So we provided you with zinc sulfate, which is a nice neutral salt, and with some sodium sulfate. Now sodium sulfate is used an awful lot. And we do a lot of these neutral salt supercapacitors because the restriction on supercapacitors with aqueous electrolytes tend to be around about 1.2 volts. So if you're using something like dilute sulfuric acid or potassium hydroxide, you can't really go above that voltage without it outgassing. If you're using these neutral salts, you can go above that voltage depending on the nature of your carbon. The sodium sulfate can get up to about 1.6 volts, and the zinc sulfate can get about 1.82 volts, somewhere around about there. So you can increase the voltage in your capacitor by using neutral salt electrolytes. You normally want 1 molar concentration. So if you don't know what a molar is, you'll have to look it up. We'll talk about it a little bit later when we make one. The other thing we provide you with, a couple of stirrers, a couple of pipettes to work with, and this stuff. This stuff is Celgard 3501. It's a polypropylene separator. It's a lovely piece of material, incidentally, and it's a high-end piece of Celgard material. It's specifically designed for water-based, zinc-based electrolytes, which is why we're providing the zinc sulfate. Now remember, zinc carries a +2 charge. Sodium carries a +1 charge, so we're expecting higher energy densities out of something where we can transfer +2 charges per atom. The Celgard is specifically designed for aqueous batteries and aqueous supercapacitors using zinc ion transport. So that's why we provide you with the Celgard, lovely bit of material. And we've also given you a couple of bits of graphite. And I love this stuff. It's one of the real problems with making supercapacitors or making devices of any type is the current collector. And the current collector will have a habit of rotting in the salt solution, whereas Grafoil won't. Now the conductivity of that at 4 ohms a square, we've given you two 100 by 100 squares, so there's plenty there to make, and then you're going to get a copy, actually it'll be a link to the copy of Supercapacitors 101, so you'll be able to download Supercapacitors 101 and have that book. So that's what's in your kit. Now, we're going to use this in a minute, and we're going to make a supercapacitor, actually a graphene supercapacitor. So we're going to use the graphene, and we're going to make a zinc-based supercapacitor out of graphene using the Graphol current collectors. But you're encouraged to experiment. These aren't something where you just do it, and you expect a great result, and you want to do loads of it. It's not like that. You're meant to experiment with it. Because all these combinations that you will make will have a difference. And as you search out things like combined salts, combined carbons, different carbon sources, different binders on those, different current collectors, you will come across something new and invent something. And that's the point. So it's an experimenter's kit, and you're meant to experiment with it. You're not meant to be doing huge yardages of this stuff. You're meant to be doing small things where you can experiment, you can give it a go, and you can try different things really quite easily, really quite readily, to be able to make your own supercapacitor, even though you can make a graphene supercapacitor right from the get-go. Now, a word of warning, and this happens very often. This kit is aimed at the beginner, people who haven't done anything before. If that's what you are, and you want to try this stuff, and you want to experiment with it, you've got everything you need to do that. Do not expect to do a massive supercapacitor right from the get-go. Let's have a think about this. Say you go to Rome, you go to the Sistine Chapel, and you see the ceiling, and you think, that's wonderful, I'm going to go and paint that. And you've never held a paintbrush in your life. And you go home and give it a go. Chances are, almost certainly, your painting is not going to be very good. Although the skill of painting is really simple. The skill of painting is very similar to the skill of drawing. It doesn't take that much to do. Let me illustrate. If I take myself a pen and a piece of paper, all that's required to draw is to do that. Take a second to show you. To draw a masterpiece is all about learning how to put those lines with the right pressure in the right direction many, many times until you create some kind of shape. So we can make a cube out of it doing that. You have to do that many, many times until you make a very nice picture. And it'll take you a lot of experimentation, a lot of experience, a lot of practice until you can paint that Sistine Chapel. You are not going to paint the Sistine Chapel by looking at it and picking up a paintbrush. In the same way, you're not going to make a really good supercapacitor. You've never made one before just because you have this kit. You will not do it. What you need to do is, just like with the painting, make small ones and practice. Like any skill, it requires practice. I've been at this 35 years. I've made thousands of these things. That's why it looks easy. It looks easy because I've been doing it so often, I just do it automatically and very quickly. If you've never done this before, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Make those mistakes on small things so it doesn't cost you much. Make them in quickly so you don't spend a lot of time. Expect to make mistakes. Don't get disheartened if something doesn't work. If you get particle drift, don't worry, add a bit more binder and try again. So the whole point is to experiment, to try, to practice, to gain the skills. And to do that, we've given you some very nice materials. So you've got some very high quality separators and some very high quality carbons to play with. Feel free to play with them. Now, in order to use these things, you're going to need some other bits and pieces. So one of the primary things you're going to need is one of these things. Now, you really need an analytical balance, but they tend to be out of everybody's pocket. What this is a jeweler's micro scale. So it goes down to about 0.001 of a gram. Just turn it on, it'll tire itself, that is, it'll rectify itself. This particular one, yes, it goes down that far. So it's good enough for what we want, and you need to be able to weigh everything. So a microbalance is really important. You need a paintbrush, a pair of scissors, a pestle and mortar, because you're going to have to grind things up, and then a little beaker so that you can make up your electrolytes. So they are the additional equipment that you need, not a significant amount, okay? So let's get on and let's make ourselves a graphene supercapacitor. So I'm taking a bit of the graphene here. Just open the lid, and there's our graphene there. And I'm not going to take very much, because again, remember, you don't need very much of this stuff. If I pop on a little bit in there, then I've got 0.023, plenty. of a gram of graphene. So it's really 0.023 of a gram. Now in the binder, and I'm going to select this one, which is the casing silicate binder, I want 1/10 of that to 1/20 of that. So I've got 0.023 of a gram. I need somewhere between 0.002 or 0.004 of a gram, so an incredibly small amount. And if you have a look in that, that means the amount you're going to put in there is just going to be ridiculously tiny. And I've just done something you should never do, and that is use the dirty end of your spatula. So, tiny little bit of that, and really it's going to be difficult to get that tiny bit in there, will give us our binder. And there we go, that's our binder. So just an infinitesimal amount. Now I pop that into the mortar, and then we add some water. The water you need to add is distilled water. Distilled water or deionized water are pretty much the same thing. And you just need to add enough of that to make it a paste. So we're going to put in 0.5 milliliter of water, which we've just done, and take your grinder and give it a grind around. And what you'll end up making is this black paste. This black paste is going to be the ink that we paint on to our current collectors. Now the secret of this is in dispersion. So the more you mix it, the better a job you're going to get. The less you mix it, the more likely you are to have a poor job. So spend time mixing it. And I'm going to put these things away. We don't need those. Don't need that anymore. Don't need those. I'm keeping the zinc sulfate separator and this out. So take a little bit of your graphite, and again, you can't say this enough. You make these devices small. You really don't need that much. Cut a little bit of your graphite off. Go back to this. Take your paintbrush, dab it in the liquid you've just made, and paint a section in the middle. Now you've got a couple of options. Either we can dry that under the hairdryer, or we can leave it to dry. I'm going to go and take it to the dryer and then be back with you after I've dried that coat on. So after you've dried it, bring it back, cut it in half, and you get 2 electrodes. And this is a symmetric capacitor because they're both covered in a carbon. And you cut yourself a piece of your cell guard, which will cover that electrode, and that's your separator, and you put that other one on top of there, and that is your graphene supercapacitor all made and ready to go. There's only one thing missing from it, and that's the electrolyte. Now, as I said, we're going to use zinc sulfate electrolyte because it's a neutral salt, allows us to raise the voltages, and a +2 charge carrier, and the cell guard is specifically made for this stuff. So we're going to use the zinc sulfate. The cell guard, incidentally, will work pretty fine with other stuff. You can also use cellulose separators, so just a piece of paper will do it, but this is really good stuff. You've been given a sodium sulfate. That's pretty much a standard salt, so if you're playing with other carbons and you want to compare them to other results, then use the sodium sulfate. Much cheaper, much easier, and it gives a standard result. The zinc sulfate will give a higher energy storage because of its ability to take a higher voltage and its +2 charge carrying. Now, the zinc sulfate hydrate here is around about 287 grams per mole. If we add a mole into 1 litre of water, we get a 1 molar solution, and we want a 1 molar solution. But we don't need to make a litre of this stuff because we'd have loads of it. So we need to make about 10 or 20 millilitres. So if I take the original weight, 287 divided by 10, I get 28.7 divided by 5, I get 5.74. And we add 5.74 grams to 20 millilitres of water, that is a 1 molar solution. If you're a bit unsure how to calculate molarity, then I suggest you read up on it, because you're going to need to do that as you do more supercapacitor work. So if you're not conversant with it, make yourself conversant with it. So we need to weigh out 5.7 grams, which isn't very much. And there we go. So you've got plenty in your bag, and you've got your weighed material there. Now the enemy of all of this is always speed. Give everything time. Let it dry properly. When we make up this electrolyte, let it mix properly. So take 20 millilitres of deionized water into our measuring beaker, or some other way you've got of measuring it. A measuring cylinder is more accurate than a measuring beaker, but a beaker will do just fine. Pop your salt into there and stir it up. Now you need to give it time to dissolve. Wait until it's dissolved properly before you use it. Same thing with this. Wait until it has dried. Now, and a little hint is, we painted that on, so the contact between the current collector and the active material is not brilliant. If you wrap it in a bit of plastic and squeeze it a little bit in a vice, it has the effect of calendaring it, which will again improve the performance of what you're making, because you're squeezing everything down. Don't squeeze too hard, try not to overdo anything, because all you'll do if you squeeze too hard is break it off the surface. Now it's pretty well adherent, but you don't want to break it off the surface because it will ruin what you've just done. So take your time, try not to overdo things. Don't think 2 moles is going to work better than 1 mole. It doesn't, as it happens. It just clogs everything up. And don't make it too big because you won't be able to handle everything, and you've got a lot of experimentation to do. Graphene is superb as a supercapacitor material apart from one problem: it collapses in on itself. So if you mix this with something like the Ketchum, then it will actually give you an improvement. So playing with the carbons, mixing things up, using different electrolytes, different salt concentrations, different binders is all some of the investigation you can do as you're making these things. Remember, this kit is a basic starter kit to get you going with some really nice materials so you can experiment and find something new yourself. That's the point of it. Anyway, that's more or less done, so we'll go with that. Now I'm doing this on the bench top, which is again not an ideal time, and when we look at the surface of this material, what we'd actually see is lots of hills and valleys. When I put the electrolyte on, it traps the gas in these little valleys. When I immediately put it on, then there's not actually that much contact between the electrolyte and the active material we've just put on there. We need to give it time to soak in, to fill those valleys and let that gas come out. So if you give that little bit of time to do that, you'll get a better result than if you're doing it immediately. Now obviously we're going to do it immediately because it's a demonstration. But there is another thing. The contact here isn't that brilliant. So if we do something to improve the contact of that, and for that I'm just going to clamp it to the bench. It just helps the contact. Don't over clamp it. Remember, don't do things too heavily with anything. A little bit of light pressure on there, and then we can connect up our positive and our negative to our capacitor and see what we get out of it. Now I have this setup here, and this setup here is obviously my lab setup, and you're not likely to have a setup like that if you're just starting out. You need to find other ways of testing it. Really simple ways of charging and discharging it are to be connected to a battery. Now I've got mine connected to the power here through this switch. If I flip that switch, the power will go through here and start charging that supercapacitor. Flip it the other way, then the power comes from the battery and through here into my load. Now this load is connected to the computer, so I can actually read what that load is doing and save that on the computer. If you don't have those things, you don't need those things. All you really need to do is put it to a lead with the battery. Just get yourself a battery, connect your supercapacitor to the battery, take off the positive and connect it to something like this. This is a little toy model helicopter. It has a little motor in there. Normally this uses a 400 milliwatt lithium ion cell to drive it. I've always also used these tiny motors, of which I don't have any because I burnt them all out. You get yourself some little kind of motor to run, or some little LED to light, or something where you take it from this, instead of putting it to this load, you put it to something. When you do that and you flip the switch, you can use a timer and time how long it takes to discharge, and that's going to give you a bit of groundwork. Now I've done lots of videos on those as techniques. Have a look at the videos and I'll tell you some of the ways to look at discharging it to get an estimation of how much power there is on there. Now the only thing we need to do now is to charge and discharge this supercapacitor, and that's what we're going to do. So let's give it a bit of charge. It doesn't take that long, and then we can discharge it. and we get a reading on here. Now I'm going to give this a little time to soak in, and then we'll give it another charge and discharge and see what happens, because we got about 2 seconds out of that, and like I said, just hasn't had the time to soak in. So let's give it a little bit longer, and then we'll try giving that a little bit longer. Actually, it's about an hour I left it. Got myself a stopwatch, and this time I've connected it up to our helicopter, because it's kind of nice to see it on there, but we're going to actually run it on there. And I'm going to flip that switch, and we should be able to spin that motor. In fact, I've already done it while the camera was off, so I know that motor's going to spin, which is why I'm doing it this way. So if I give that a flip, and then we get a considerable amount of power from this little device, able to spin that motor. It's quite a powerful motor. Bear in mind, this device is round about 1.5 centimetres by 1.5 centimetres. So it has stored considerable energy. And finish. So 25 seconds of spinning this helicopter motor for a 1.5 centimetre by 1.5 centimetre device. So your devices do not need to be huge. You can make them quite small, you can test them by spinning motors, and you can charge them from a battery. And you can do lots and lots of experimentation to find something that's actually better than this. Now remember, some of our devices are much better than this. Some of our carbon devices of this size will run that motor for 6-10 minutes, something like that. You can find those too. The starter kit is meant just to help you make a start in investigating supercapacitors. You're not meant to build your own supercapacitor bank. You're meant to give it a go with the graphene supercapacitor, make some changes to it, see what you can come up with. Now, I'd love to know what you come up with. So if you do some videos, please do link me in on the videos. I'd be absolutely fascinated to see. If you want to ask questions, there's an awful lot of information on the YouTube channel where I've done things about charging and discharging, done things on making techniques, so please do review those first, because I get a lot of email and I can't always be available to answer every single question. Gone through some of the common errors that are made, so pay attention please to what I've actually said. Don't expect to run a race when you've just started training. You're going to be a little slow, take your time, expect some failures, and learn from those failures and move on. This kit is available on the Indiegogo campaign, and the link is in the description below. Later it will be available in the shop, but it will be more expensive in the shop, because we want to say thank you to the people who are supporting us in the Indiegogo campaign. Anyway, I hope that was of interest to you, and thank you very much for watching. Let's just see what that does again. That's awesome.